commercial where the guy is in the insurance, he's the troublemaking insurance guy who causes mayhem, and he talks about how he's got tens and tens of viewers on long range. I don't know, we'll see, hopefully a lot of folks will want to. It's really nice to be with you all. Thank you so much for having me. Gosh, this is a beautiful facility. It's like public structures, public systems, hey, tax dollars, it works. But I'm always honored to be with you all. Y'all are committed to the cause, and it's great to be with you. I do want to tell you about NC Newsline. So for the last, it's been 16 years, I worked for a project called NC Policy Watch. Before that, I was a lawyer who worked in the General Assembly as an advocate for poor people with a group called the North Carolina Justice Center. NC Policy Watch was for many years a project of the Justice Center. It started out really as a one, and then when I joined it, two-person commentary shop. There's a guy named Chris Fitzsimon. Many of you may remember Chris. He used to be on NC Spin. He was a very prominent former journalist, a very prominent progressive commentator. Chris founded NC Policy Watch and hired me as the second person, and together it was just the two of us for a while. And Chris had the bright idea, we need to, he was a journalist who idolized Ben Bradley and, All the President's Men. And he said, the news media is evaporating before our eyes. When Chris and I both started going to the North Carolina General Assembly in the late 80s and early 90s, there was this thriving beehive of activity called the press room, where there were reporters from all the local papers around the state, and AP had 3 or 4 reporters, and there was radio coverage, and it was just, that's how it should have been. But of course, we all watched as it sort of, the traditional, we now refer to as the legacy news media, sort of evaporated before our eyes. And Chris said, we need to do something about this. We need to do what we can to fill in some of those gaps. And so we got some funding, and we were lucky enough to start hiring a handful of investigative reporters to work for us. One of the first ones we hired was a woman named Sarah Obaska, who had been an investigative reporter with Raleigh's News and Observer. And in 2012, I think it was, her reporting sent a prominent Republican legislator to federal prison for corruption. And we realized, okay, there's some power in what we're doing here with this journalism stuff. And the national funders saw it and said, this is great, we want to give you some more, to hire some more people. And then in 2017, they came to Chris and said, this is great, you need to do this in every state. And Chris was like, excuse me, I need a lot of money and staff. And they said, okay. And so Chris informed me late in 2017, hey man, I'm leaving. I'm going to start something called States Newsroom, and I'm leaving you to run this darn thing called NC Policy Watch. And States Newsroom is based in Chapel Hill. It's now in 32 cities with newsrooms based upon our model. We're pretty, it's pretty cool to have been a flagship for that. For a variety of historic reasons, Policy Watch had been housed in a group called the North Carolina Justice Center, which is a wonderful advocacy organization. I, in fact, had been an attorney there in the past. But over time, it became, an awkward fit. We were a journalism organization that hired journalists to do straight reporting, and our commentary was biting and often very pointed at state legislators. Meanwhile, the Justice Center, where lobbyists had to go over to the General Assembly and say, please support this bill. Well, that Schofield guy's been calling me this and that, and online every week. So it was a conflict for them. It was a conflict for our reporters who found that they were part of an advocacy organization, and they were privy to information they shouldn't have been privy to. Or they would see memos going around to the staff, and it was an awkward fit. So a determination was made, well, it makes more sense for us to be part of States Newsroom, this national network that's been growing like a mushroom across the country. And so finally, last fall, we were able to work out the details of making that happen. So, there were a lot of details working out, as I was saying back beforehand, when we were, putting the websites together. And indeed, if you go to ncnewsline.com right now, which is the new website, you'll find there's still a few little bugs in the system. We had 52,000 articles to bring over to our new site. So there's a lot of imagery and stories and commentaries and recordings. I do a nightly radio commentary that's on Mix 101. We have a radio show, News and Views, which is also a podcast. So there's just a tremendous amount of content, but we're working our way through it. And we're really excited about the new setup. So NC Newsline, we used to have 2 websites. It's now all neatly combined into one, ncnewsline.com. We are, as Rebecca also said, proudly nonpartisan, although we feature progressive, hard-hitting progressive commentary. Our reporters play it straight. They are there to tell the truth. If they find corruption in a Democratic official, they'll expose that. One of the stories we did a few years ago was about a Democratic legislator from Raleigh who was a sexual misconduct perpetrator, cost him his job. So our reporters are proudly, it's an interesting gig for me because I started out as a do-gooder lawyer and now I work with a team of reporters and they're all curmudgeonly, grumpy, cynical people who are incredibly hardworking, talented, and inspiring at the same time. Lisa Sorg is our tremendous environmental reporter. You all probably know she's one of the best in the country. She was awarded last year National Press Foundation Award for her investigation into this aging missile factory in Burlington that's just been sitting there for decades, leaking toxic chemicals into nearby neighborhoods. She's also written a series of stories, speaking of nonpartisan, 23 stories now, I think, about really the very lame hurricane recovery response that the North Carolina, that the Cooper administration has overseen, sadly, over the last few years. I think Governor Cooper's taken some steps to do the right thing to respond to that, but it's still, in many ways, a failed response to Hurricanes Matthew and Floyd. People still living in, one-star hotels now in 2023 for hurricanes that happened years and years ago. So Lisa's just a tremendous force of nature. She had stories today about how in the new appropriations bill at the General Assembly, there's a word that was slipped into, actually it's the Farm Bill, not the appropriations bill. A word was slipped into the Farm Bill that's going to make it a lot easier for hog farms to release methane into the atmosphere by basically just burning it off rather than piping it as it was supposed to be done with gas renewable energy. So Lisa's great. Greg Childress, a veteran of 3 decades of reporting in the Triangle and education. He's our education reporter. He worked at the Durham Herald Sun for many years. He's written a lot about charter schools and some of the problems that some of them have been experiencing, voucher schools. We have Joe Killian. Joe was the political reporter for the Greensboro News and Record for many years, and then he joined us. Gosh, it's been 6 years now. Joe's written a ton of stories about higher education. He was the person who wrote the whole story about Nicole Hannah-Jones, the famed journalist who lost the gig at UNC Chapel Hill because of some right-wing funders of the school. It's worked out for her, thank goodness, very well. But anyway, Joe also is really specialized in writing about LGBTQ issues and discrimination. That seems to be the favored approach of many of our state leaders. Lynn Bonner, 25 years with the News and Observer in Raleigh. Lynn has been covering state government most of her adult life, and she's doing it now for us. She had a story just last week about Tricia Cotho, the Charlotte area legislator who decided that she was going to change teams. And we also have Kellen Lyons. Kellen just joined us last year. He's a younger member of our team. We're kind of a graveyard crew. Kellen came to us from the Connecticut Mirror. Kellen's specialty is really corrections, prisons, criminal justice, and he wrote, you all haven't read this yet, last Wednesday, his story about a guy named Bobby Norfleet, who is a person who was convicted of a crime in 1979 in northeastern North Carolina, Washington County. He was accused and convicted and pled guilty to arson. He had a fight with his girlfriend. He's 23 years old. He tried to set a porch on her back, the back of her house on fire. It went out in no time. There was no damage, nobody was hurt. But because of a quirk in the way state law stood at that time, there was only one sentence for arson, which was life in prison. And he pled guilty. He had $10 to his name. He had a young lawyer who'd been practicing law for 6 months. He was sentenced to life in prison. And he's, about a year ago, a lawyer with the group Disability Rights North Carolina, who works to help incarcerated people in our state and also people who are institutionalized, was contacted by a social worker who went to the prison and said, this guy is really old and really feeble and has been abused for 40 years in prison. Somebody's got to do something about about this. Now, if he had been convicted a month later, the state had just a month later changed to go to a sentencing law that made a tiered system for arson. So probably what would have happened is he would have gotten sentenced to 10 or 20 years in prison and probably served 5, which was still pretty serious punishment for what he did. But anyway, his life is, I mean, 43 years of hell, basically, and miraculously he got out. And it's a great story. It's a long story, but read it. There's some video of him sort of celebrating, and it's a very powerful story. Kellen got that story, and we're so proud of the work he does. So we got a great team. And we also have Clayton Hinkle, who runs the whole thing. She's the person who keeps our websites running, produces the radio show, and the podcast, and the commentaries. So it's a great team of veterans. She's a veteran newsroom news director for various outlets. So check us out. You can also check out newsfromthestates.com. Newsfromthestates.com. That is the place where all the stories from all the news outlets like ours, as well as our Washington, D.C. bureau, which we're lucky enough to feature their content, is all compiled every day. So you can get all you need to know. And it's sort of interesting to look and see what the other states are producing and see how many common themes there are, whether it's the attacks on transgender people, the attack on so-called critical race theory. It's a great way to see how most of the laws that are being advanced in the North Carolina General Assembly these days are, copycat legislation. They come from ALEC or they come from some of the conservative think tanks. So there's lots of hot topics we could talk about, and I do want to say, please interrupt if you have questions or comments or suggestions, but I guess we're here to talk about sort of what's going on in North Carolina politics these days. And I guess from my point of view, it's important to remember, and I'm sure this is important for y'all to think about as people who are trying to affect change, the dominant story remains in at least state government right now is gerrymandering. Our legislature is obviously hopelessly gerrymandered. We have concrete evidence of this from the 2022 elections, in which we saw, well, what the heck, we actually are having a pretty well drawn out map for congressional districts, and lo and behold, what happened? 7 Republicans were elected and 7 Democrats, reflecting the fact that it's a purple state, it's a 50-50 state. Maybe it's leaned a little bit to the Republicans in recent elections, but Governor Cooper won handily in 2020, Attorney General Stein, Democrats, are polling right around 50% on lots and lots, if not better, on lots and lots of statewide elections. But because of gerrymandering, because of the fact that our legislative districts remain hopelessly rigged, and the courts really were pretty tame in their efforts to try and curb that, the General Assembly leans very heavily Republican, and it's been a sort of self-perpetuating process for the last decade. Ever since they took over in 2010, they have constantly redrawn the maps so that they assure themselves of continued majorities. 2022 being an off-year election, it generally favors the party that's out of power in the White House. It was, pretty much a given that Republicans were going to have a pretty good year. They actually didn't pick up much, but they picked up enough seats to put themselves very close to super majorities now in both houses. As you all know, it's 30-20 in the Senate, which is just enough to override a gubernatorial veto. We thought it was 71-49 in the state house, which would be one vote short of the 60% required. But of course, last week was the big development with the decision by Representative Cotham from Mecklenburg County to change teams. I spent a half an hour actually this afternoon on the radio with a fellow who hosts a show in California, wanting to know what the hell's going on in North Carolina. This is national news. What happened to why did this person switch? And what I said was, I don't think anybody knows for sure. I think we tend sometimes to imagine that there are all kinds of grand schemes and long-term plans and really diabolical plots to do stuff, and usually it's more likely to be explained by human sloth and competence and just guesswork. I'm not sure that Representative Cotham has any particular grand scheme. We all know that when she was in the General Assembly before, she just returned this in the most recent election, she was an outspoken progressive. She spoke openly on the floor of the State House about an abortion she had obtained and how it was nobody's business. She had won awards from Equality North Carolina for her support of LGBTQ rights. She was a former classroom teacher who defended public education. After she left, we noted the fact that she had gone to work as a lobbyist and had taken on some clients in the sort of school privatization world that were, I think, raised some eyebrows about some of the clients she had taken on. And I know we had a lot of trouble suddenly getting her to respond to our inquiries for stories. And so I think we were all watching and sort of wondering what was going on. And then when she was elected, with 59% of the vote this past November in a Democratic district with a website that had a picture of Joe Biden on it, I think nonetheless a lot of people were sort of curious and watching to see what would happen. And then almost very soon thereafter we heard that, well, you know, she's been having some conversations with the speaker, and there's talk of her being one of the Democrats that might actually get a committee chair this session. And then she escorted the speaker down the hall, or down the aisle to be installed as speaker at the start of the year. So, you know, it's a chicken and egg thing. She said, well, Democrats were mean to me, and they didn't, you know, they didn't respect me, and they didn't want to hear from me. And the Democrats were like, yeah, but you're working with the Republican House Speaker. Obviously, I did a commentary this week in which I argued that, you know, I don't think her constituents gave a rat's ass about the fact that they were being mean to her in the General Assembly. I think they thought, we're voting for a progressive Democrat who's going to defend reproductive freedom and equality and push back against this rightward turn in our state. But it remains to be seen. Governor Cooper tweeted, I think it was today, I saw him tweet to the effect, well, she's still in a position to stop some bad laws if she wants to do it. So she has not really come out and said, I'm now with the Republicans on everything, so I guess we'll be waiting to see. She did pose for a picture, which was, I think, caught a lot of people's eyes. It was in front of the dais, and you probably have seen this in the General Assembly with a sort of a coterie of conservative Christian pastors. Her mom is been a long-time county commissioner in Mecklenburg County, a Democrat. So it'll be really interesting. The bottom line of all this is that a lot of things hang by a thread, and maybe it's gotten even thinner. The Republicans have made very few bones about pursuing an agenda that really features a lot of the culture war issues, a lot of the things that Governor Cooper has vetoed over the last 4 years and been able to sustain those vetoes. They've gone right back at it this year. They've made those right, in a year in which our children are being mowed down in their classrooms by gun violence, and in which our schools are crumbling, and so many needs in our state. We have mental health crisis in the state. The top priority is to make sure that, that nobody gets uncomfortable in discussing race in the classrooms, or that we, God forbid, that a trans kid would be called by the pronoun that they prefer. So it'll be a lot of very close votes, one suspects. I mean, even before the transition to Cotham's move last week, there was lots of talk about the fact that there were Democrats in the House caucus who were not, solid votes on a lot of issues. And of course, we've already seen that in the fact that the handgun background check law that the states had on the books for decades was repealed just hours after the tragedy in Nashville. So, pretty remarkable set of affairs. So, I guess, and then of course the other outcome of the 2022 election that was sobering for Democrats and probably most progressives was what happened with the Supreme Court. Of course, we had a Supreme Court that was 4-3 Democratic, that had issued a series of important, even landmark rulings near the end of last year's term on education and voting, I think in hopes that traditional rules of precedent in the judiciary, and what we call stare decisis, the idea that once decided, things generally stand. We all watched how Roe versus Wade stood for 49 years, even though there was a move to overrule it. But of course, the court turned. There were 2 seats up, 2 Democratic seats of those 4, and narrowly, the Republicans won both seats, and so they now enjoy 5-2 majority on the state Supreme Court, and that is going to be that way for a while because they serve 8-year terms on the court. They have moved with remarkable and alarming speed to just reverse decisions that were made just months ago. They're not making any bones about it. This is sort of keeping with what has been the conservative strategy when it comes to the courts at the national level. We all saw it with the process of nominating and filling U.S. Supreme Court vacancies. These folks don't mess around, they play hardball. They blocked Barack Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, for a full year, and then managed to get Amy Coney Barrett through in about 3 weeks. So there's very little shame when it comes to this. If they're out to win, they're pursuing that approach, and we see it in the General Assembly as well. So now that I bummed you all out pretty thoroughly, I think there's some things to keep in mind, though, about the reality that we confront today, both here in Harnett County and in North Carolina and the nation. It's sobering. It's a time in which one can worry about our democracy, about just the health of our planet. But there are also a lot of really hopeful signs still out there in terms of how just last November, how the election went nationally. The fact that the Republicans had anticipated there would be this huge defeat for President Biden, the Senate would go Republican, didn't, of course. The House, only very narrowly did the Republicans take back control of the U.S. House. And I think the general rise in voting support for reproductive freedom, we saw the results in several states where abortion rights were on the ballot, and there was a direct repudiation of efforts to restrict abortion in several states you wouldn't have expected, Kansas, Kentucky. So my sense is that we are clearly a divided nation, we are a divided state, we have very formidable forces who are trying to advance a very conservative, I would say even very progressive agenda, and yet one senses that, I have the sense that the wave is beginning to crest, and in fact maybe there's a bit of overreach. I think maybe Cotham's move is sort of symbolic of that. The folks who are in power now in the General Assembly are so cocksure and so pay so little attention to any critiques or even pretending to have any open process in the General Assembly, any open debate. I just feel like it can't last. That can't be your model for governing, and you'll be there for forever in that mode. At some point, I think the truth is going to have to break through, and people are going to see what's been going on. And we alluded to the fact that that there really isn't much process anymore in the General Assembly. And we have, occasionally I'll have Democratic legislators on our radio show, News and Views, to talk about what's going on, and I'll ask them, what's the word on this or that? And I don't know, I'm in the General Assembly, but they don't tell me. All I know is I just have to show up every day, because if I don't, they might hold a vote on, an important matter that I didn't know was going to be voted on today. And that just strikes me as something that is unsustainable in the long run. The Republicans, ironically enough, came to power in 2010 promising to bring openness and transparency to government, to run government like a business. And, obviously, power has a tendency to corrupt once you're in there for a long time. There's a bill I wrote a column about for tomorrow morning. There's a group called Disability Rights. I think I mentioned them already. Disability Rights North Carolina, the group that helped get Bobby Norfleet out of prison. They've also brought lots of litigation on the rights of people who are living in institutions, people with developmental disabilities, trying to get better services, better treatment, get rid of these insane waiting lists where people are on waiting lists for 15, 20 years. The General Assembly introduced a bill that, now this is a wholly private 501c3 organization. It used to be a state agency, but it was spun off 15 years ago. It gets some federal dollars, but it is a 501c3 nonprofit, totally independent. Legislature ran a bill through the House last week to require them to start reporting to the legislature what they're doing. We want to know what you're doing and when and how much you're spending. It's a private organization. I mean, it's no different than if they had required, I don't know, pick your private organization, a civil rights organization, a garden club, I don't know, a church, and just said, we want you to start reporting to us. And to me, that was just emblematic of sort of, they've kind of lost their way, and they're sort of a little bit drunk on power right now, the folks who are running the state legislature. That doesn't mean there aren't going to be a lot more setbacks for those who caring and thinking people, but it indicates to me that maybe they're starting to get a little bit out on their skis a little bit. So Obviously, a lot of incredibly important issues will be debated in the coming weeks in the General Assembly. The budget, always the most important bill that the General Assembly passes, probably more important than it should be because it'll be hundreds of pages and it will contain lots and lots of substantive law changes that have nothing to do with funding government. For instance, the House unveiled a budget last week. So last week, the days run together, maybe it's the week before. That has a provision to extend the retirement date for justices of the Supreme Court. So this is because Paul Newby is the Supreme Court Chief Justice. He would be out of his term, before his term is up, he would be required to retire because he was currently at age 72 retirement mandate, but that would be raised to 76. There are provisions in there to take North Carolina out of a national system that tries to get more funding for elections. There's all kind of more of the sort of school privatization, pro-voucher stuff that's in the budget, less oversight of private schools that get funding, expansion of vouchers. So that budget bill will contain a lot of that stuff, and as you all know, it's a sort of sad development with respect to Medicaid expansion, which is this huge victory that everybody is so happy about, and it's a wonderful thing. North Carolina finally going to become the 40th state to expand Medicaid, at least we think we are, as per the bill that was passed by the General Assembly and signed by Governor Cooper. But of course, the Republicans made sure that that won't go into effect until the state budget passes. So we're now in a position that in order to get this bipartisan, popular, life-saving change that we literally know for a fact that there have been thousands upon thousands of North Carolinians who've suffered premature deaths over the last decade for our failure to expand Medicaid. We could have expanded it last week and we would have saved several lives in the next couple months. We're going to have to wait until the budget gets through. We'll see what happens. Governor Cooper is going to be put in a tough spot because if he vetoes the budget, then he vetoes Medicaid expansion. But if he signs the budget, he approves all these other reactionary ideas that will undoubtedly be stuffed in the budget. So it's the reality of politics. It's what Cooper signed up for. I'm not sure he thought this was exactly what it would be like. It's been an interesting 6 going on 8 years he's had. I see if someone wants to ask a question in the back before I go on.
Yeah, I hear all this, but I don't see it. I sat down and talked to Senator Jim Berger. One of the things he asked was because we sat down with him and explained to him all these things over the years and why they're better. The reason why it's spent Medicare is because it's the only way you can approach the drug problem. And when it was explained to him why, he sat there and said, yes, that's necessary. We have mental health going on in the jail system. We pushed so hard for that with it. We pushed very hard for a lot of reform with David Lewis. When he was, even though no one liked to stop at, it was something we worked together on. North Carolina law reduction coalition. So
Yeah, I know what that is.
we did the program, we got lots of laws passed, we even went to participate. It helped with 2 laws to be passed that had to do with one, the care squad issue, and some other issues. The point is, some of them are working. Some of them Republicans are sitting there saying, I don't want trouble. If you sit down with them and get them out of their frame of mind, that's both sides. Or sitting there saying, hey, look, we got the politics, which I keep hearing. If you sit down and say, no, this is the science, this is what's happening, this is what reality is. And when you show it to them, and you sit down with them, and all people together are doing it, amazing how many of those who pass that are Democratic, all out, and that's been on for 7 years that we've been working on. He's got 55 bills that's presented to the legislation. And basically, we have to back down a little bit because we're not going to be very good people on either side of the fence. So he's going out there and he's going to have about 20 of those bills that we've been pushing for him for 7 years. And I'm looking forward to them being passed. When we went to the Democratic Party and asked them, hey, look, these bills we needed, they said, no, I don't need to change the bills they have. They didn't need to do anything. Why just change a word in the bill? The way it was and it passed. And we got it passed.
I I appreciate your comment. The comment, for those perhaps listening online, the comment was a bit of a pushback to me, saying, look, we've been working with some of these legislators, Republican legislators, we've got some stuff done, and here's some examples, and I don't deny that at all. There's some good folks in the Republican Party, people who are not ideologues or people who are corrupt or believers in Trumpism. What I see, however, is what I have to report what I see, which is the overriding trends that we see in the General Assembly. Is we see no debate, we see no open debate, we see a tax system that has gotten increasingly regressive, that has ratcheted up taxes on people in the middle and the bottom while lowering taxes on people at the top, ending the corporate income tax, seeing our public schools be gradually and devastatingly defunded over the last decade to the point where we're much below Alabama and South Carolina now. Our teachers are leaving the state in droves because we can't fill the positions in the prisons, we can't fill the positions in our mental health institutions because we don't have enough funding. So there are some good things that have gotten done. Jim Bergen's done some good things, but by and large, the trends in our state over the last decade, I would argue, have been pretty regressive. We've lost a lot of the progress of the state. The Democrats were far from perfect. There were lots of bad decisions that Democrats, when they were in leadership, made.
Those laws you're talking about, if you challenge in court, the Chief Justice, he turned around and he was called a bigot. He's not supposed to be able to make decisions, for instance, on the district. He's not supposed to be able to make judgments on African Americans. He's not supposed to be able to make judgments on things to do with religion. Because he stated, he ran, and he doesn't support the religion.
Sounds like maybe we should have a debate afterwards, perhaps. I hear you making some interesting points, but I want to, maybe I can finish my remarks. Maybe I can finish my remarks and then we can talk some more. I guess the only, we can look forward a little bit to where we're going now. I talked about the budget, I talked about some of the other bills we'll see in the General Assembly this session. We'll see more, it looks like we're going to see more efforts to target transgender kids, targeting transgender health care in the state. That's been a trend that we're seeing across the country. We'll see more efforts to undermine work on climate change, sadly. We'll see likely more, there may be some progress on mental health funding. There's some hope there that the things have gotten so dire and the state has got so much money to spend that we may actually see some improvement there. Keep your fingers crossed, we might see more school nurses, more school counselors. The state is so far behind in that area. We can talk about, obviously, the abortion rights hanging by a thread. North Carolina is in many ways a sanctuary state. There are a lot of pregnant people who come to our state because they are in, say, Tennessee, where we have sort of an 18th century laws on abortion rights. North Carolina, not perfect. We have a nonsensical 20-week ban that's caused a lot of problems for a lot of people. It seems to me that the Republicans haven't quite yet figured out what they want to do in that area. We have some people who are extreme ideologues who want to make abortion murder and all that kind of nonsense. But it seems almost inevitable that we'll have some kind of law sent to Governor Cooper, and it'll be the ultimate test of whether we can override, whether there will be a veto override. We've seen sort of negative path on gun violence. We have seen no progress on things like immigration reform, tax fairness, LGBTQ equality. It'd be interesting to see what they do with marijuana. There's a move, of course, for medical marijuana in the state. Not surprisingly, the law is drafted in such a way that will make it easier for wealthy people with health insurance to get marijuana. Probably not so easy for poor people who might have less desirable illnesses. That would be interesting to see. There may be some hope for some criminal justice reform. There's been some movement for sentencing reform and recognizing that our prisons are just bursting at the seams, understaffed. A lot of people who are no threat to society probably need to be out. In the long run, and then we've got the 2044 election right around the corner, of course. And that's going to be a fascinating one. It's already looking very much as if it'll be a gubernatorial race between Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, assuming he doesn't have some sort of a blow up, which is entirely also plausible, and Attorney General Josh Stein. There's been lots of talk that Senator Tillis is kind of tired of Washington and would like to figure out a way to run for governor. I think Tillis, I have a theory that just about everybody who's in politics above the level of dog catcher can concoct a scenario where they become president of the United States. And I'm sure Tillis has done that in his dreams at night. And sometimes people think that being a governor is a better stepping stone to being president, or getting more national attention. I don't know. I think he'd have a tough time in a Republican primary with Robinson. Robinson is, it seems unimaginable that someone so inexperienced, who's never really even held down much of a job in his life, but who rose to fame by giving a pro-gun rant at a city council meeting and going viral, could somehow be elected as the highest-ranking Republican in state politics, but he succeeded on it. And he's got some skills. He's got some incredibly extreme views. He's been blatantly anti-Semitic. He has made statements about LGBTQ people that are uniformly hateful and offensive, but it'll be fascinating to see how that goes down. And people are already lining up to run for the other offices. There's a group of Republican lawmakers who like to be Attorney General. Lieutenant Governor tends to be kind of a forgotten job, but maybe Robinson will breathe some life into it if he gets a Republican nomination for governor. In the long run, I still think that this is a deeply purple 50-50 state. It remains one in which I think the demographics are gradually shifting so that urban areas are growing, which tend to vote Bloomer, and rural areas are shrinking. Gerrymandering is an enormously powerful tool, especially with digital technology, and so Republicans are likely to be able to hold that, make that work for them for quite a few more years. But at some point, I think the demographic wave will overtake it, and I think it's likely North Carolina will not remain in sort of the reactionary position that it is right now. And in the long run, it's really important, even in places where I'm sure it's challenging, living in Harnett County. I know it's a deeply red county, and I'm old enough to remember when red was a good color. It's incredibly important to continue to be engaged, to talk on social media, to participate in debates, to speak to your friends. Things can change really rapidly in modern politics, especially with digital modern communications being what they are. It can be shocking sometimes how an attitude of view, point of view can sort of catch fire. And so I wouldn't get too down or too convinced that things are like they are now and can be that way forever. I think there's still a great prospect for positive change in our state in the not too distant future. So I'd say stay engaged, be active. You make a difference, even by making people work harder to do what they do in places like Wilmington. So keep up the good work. And I don't know, I saw a question already. Maybe we can have a conversation. And I guess I should repeat it for the online audience. You think people can hear? Okay, go ahead.
I'll try to speak loud. In spite of the proliferation of media options, you don't have to look very hard, especially in this county, to see that voters in the main are poorly informed. Would you comment a little bit about state media in general, and specifically about the Fox News Dominion lawsuit, which, as I understand, is scheduled to commence April 17th, could have huge implications for how we get information?
Well, there's no doubt, as I alluded to initially, that the demise of traditional media in our country, traditional news media, what we all refer to now as legacy news media, I think has been a negative development. When I arrived, I told you about the press room at the legislature. There was also a flock of reporters assigned to each department and state agencies for the News and Observer. And my office now overlooks the shell of what used to be the News and Observer building, which is vacant at this point. So there's obviously been a tremendous demise of reporters that people relied upon to understand the government. I think there's also been, sort of at the same time, this assault on generalized public education that I think has also had a negative impact on people's understanding of the world, of their willingness to engage, and their willingness to pay attention to politics in our society. I'm not sure that's coincidental. I'm not sure that the folks who are the authors of the privatization of our public schools haven't thought about that. That may be one of their motivations. As for Fox News, I mean, obviously, has been a tremendously, and remains a tremendously influential phenomenon in our country that has, it's hard to think of a media phenomenon that's had more of an effect on our politics, and it seems likely to remain that way for a while. And yet there are plenty of other aspiring Fox Newses out there that even if somehow Fox News suffers a devastating judicial defeat, perhaps a financial defeat that could cause it to suffer mightily, there are plenty of other contenders out there who aspire to sort of fill that role. So, I just don't believe in the long run, though, that our country, that the successful model for governance depends upon misinforming people and telling people lies and falsehoods about reality. At some point, especially in this world in which we can all communicate, I realize there's lots of negatives in social media. We're talking now about the possibility of these new technologies that allow us to superimpose words on the mouths of politicians and make it seem as if they really said things that they didn't say. There's lots to be worried about out there, but I still have faith that at some point the truth will prevail, and that it just can't be a successful model for running a giant nation to have it based upon falsehoods. Yes, sir.
Well, it's simple thing. I want to thank the company. NC Newsline. And I'll see you right beside the newsletter.
Thank you so much. We got the link fixed, so you didn't get the Arizona Mirror. I got a call today from someone saying I tried to sign up for your newsletter and I got the Arizona Mirror.
I was the older publications like yours, like the Assembly, or Rose Coast.
North Carolina Health News. I think it's an evolving net. It's really interesting for me as a recovering lawyer turned journalist to work with a bunch of reporters who sort of look at the other guys kind of askance. Competition. I want to get the story first. So it's been interesting to see, but we're all pretty much, low budget nonprofits for the most part. North Carolina Health News, which Rose Hogan runs, does a great job on lots of stories. There's Carolina Public Press, which is based out west. The Assembly's trying to do, I think the Assembly's taking more of an approach where they're kind of like a magazine approach. They're not trying to do as much daily reporting as we try to do. But we've started to, there's an outlet in Asheville called the Asheville Watchdog. And we're a group of retired, like Pulitzer Prize winning journalists who are sitting around in Asheville where they have retired to going, Jesus, we can have a good news outlet here. And they created this new outlet. And I think we've started to find ourselves cross-pollinating a little more and publishing each other's content and not feeling like we're putting ourselves at risk or somehow losing it in the competitive. There's plenty of work to go around, plenty of reporting to be done. Kellen's story on Bobby Norfleet, the fellow who was sentenced to prison for life for trying to start a fire, has been run in a wide array of outlets, and we've been trying to promote it, and both nationally and here in the States. I think we're all sort of figuring it out, but that's another point where I think maybe there's some grounds for optimism. There is a growing movement of nonprofit journalists, even at the local level. There's some others. Layton County's got an outlet now, and some of the other parts of North Carolina. So, Rebecca.
Rob, I'd like to talk about school vouchers.
Okay.
Because I'm really concerned that the loss of income will starve our public schools. Can you explain what's in the budget that pertains to school vouchers and how it will affect our school systems?
I can't quote you the exact statistics, and it's important to remember that we've only seen the House budget. The Senate will take another stab at it, but the basic trend has been to make it easier to get vouchers. Traditionally it was a program supposedly for only low-income students, parents whose income was below a certain level. But now they keep raising it. They make it easier to get vouchers, and that seems to be the plan. I mean, Paul Stamp, who was the longtime House Republican second in command in the House before he retired a few years ago, said it was his goal. He was unabashed. My goal is to make every school a voucher school. And I think that there is a substantial part, not all, but a substantial wing of the current conservative movement that just doesn't believe in traditional idea of public schools. They refer to them, you'll hear it on talk radio, derisively as government schools. That's what they'll refer to public schools as, government school, which is designed to be, of course, to have negative connotations and the implication that, you know, that this is socialism or something like that. So public schools have their work cut out for them. Interestingly, though, we've seen, for instance, recently that the state of Alabama, of all places, has dramatically upped teacher salaries for their public schools, soaring past North Carolina. So I think it's like a lot of issues where I'm not so sure there's a whole lot of ideological uniformity within the Republican Party or within the conservative movement. One thing you can say about Donald Trump is, while I generally disagree with just about everything Donald Trump ever did or said, he didn't have any ideological purity. He was not a true believer in the cause that the John Locke Foundation and the Heritage Foundation have been espousing for years. And there's a substantial group of people that came to the Republican Party because of him, not because they believed in, you know, throwing away public schools or defunding government. So it's an interesting, they have their own sort of divides within their party, and I'm not sure that in the long run, notwithstanding all the trouble that they have endured, our public schools remain popular, our teachers remain popular. The idea of vouchers generally still does not pull well. Like a lot of issues that the right has been championing in the General Assembly, they actually don't poll very well. Tax cuts for corporations, limits on reproductive freedom, failure to have safe gun violence laws, those things don't poll well. But they've been able to sort of manipulate people with these sort of tactics around some of the social issues and targeting LGBT people, things like that. So I think in the public school realm, it's always sort of this catch-22. They'll complain about the public schools and say they're not doing a good job, and then they won't fund them, and then it makes it harder for them to do a good job. And so it's a dilemma. But, so it's something we're paying attention to.
Well, with all these, you know, unpopular views and laws they're trying to pass, then, I mean, are they being funded by lobbyists? And that's why they're bringing all of these laws up in these different states to be passed, where we know
It varies. An example, I can tell you one example in the General Assembly right now where Republicans and Democrats are being very effectively pushed by lobbyists is gambling. We're going to have digital 24/7, 365 gambling on our cell phones in North Carolina because of lobbying by the gambling industry, which I would argue it's the only time Mark Creech of the Christian Action League has actually called me to say he thought I was right about something. It's one of those rare instances where the religious right is, I think, right on this one. I think I'm very worried about that. So in some instances it is lobbyists.
But like with gun control, I mean, 90%, they did a poll, 90%, including Republicans with guns, or want some sort of sensible gun, you know.
I know, but the people who fund campaigns in the gun lobby.
Yeah, so I'm like, well, why aren't these politicians passing these horrible?
Part of it also has to do with passion. There are a lot of issues in which things poll progressive, but, you know, most voters are not paying a lot of attention. But the folks who believe in the Second Amendment, man, that is their thing. And you know, there's a devoted core of people who are really passionate about that. And that's the case with, you know, probably, it's also true probably with the anti-abortion movement, where we know that's a minority in the country. They still are very, very passionate, very hardworking, and sometimes they simply have outworked progressives. So it's a challenge. Yes, ma'am, Beth. No, you're fine.
So I generally was, there's some things to be excited about in the House budget regarding families and early childhood experiences in the first 5 years. But by and large, felt very flat in names of the crisis that the field and the industry is facing. What's your commentary on that? How can such a bipartisan, traditionally issue not get the funding and the attention? What do you suspect on the Senate side, and how generally can we bring attention to the urgent needs for families with children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews in the first 5 vulnerable years of life for everyone?
Well, it sounds like you ought to be one of their spokespeople. I mean, that's one of the
The
ways.
opportunity I can get.
I hope you will. I'm not not terribly optimistic about the Senate. I mean, let's face it, what has happened over the last decade is the people that have been running the General Assembly have generally taken the point of view that government is the source of the problem. They have generally taken the point of view that public structures, public institutions are something we need to have to kind of keep things running, but they're not the solution to the problems we face. And so they've systematically disinvested in public education, in public health, in an array of public structures and services, even transportation, mass transit, environmental protection, the things that really knit together a middle-class society. They have taken the point of view that that's something we need to do on the cheap, basically. And early childhood education is a classic example. Maternal health, where we don't have enough providers. Just the whole idea that we don't have enough nurses in our public schools. I just continue to be shocked by, I mean, how hard would it be to just fund so that we have a nurse in every school in the state? That's the approach they take. And if you read the John Locke Foundation, who a lot of the Republicans do, if you read what they say, I mean, they write articles about how we need to stop making sure so many kids get free lunches in school. You know, like that's a real terrible negative in society that some kid whose parents make, 5% more than the standard is getting a free lunch in school. God forbid, like that's the big problem in society. But that's what they truly believe, that, government is the problem. We need to cut taxes, we need to cut funding. So it's going to be a slog. I think there is some, they got so much money right now because of the relief that the Biden administration has provided. They don't know quite what to do with it. They've got huge surpluses. They could easily fund the Leandro education lawsuit. They could fund our schools what they need. They could fund the programs you're describing, but it just runs against the grain for so many of the legislators who are in charge.
Economic growth and the amount of businesses that are coming to North Carolina, those employees have young children. And in order for the mothers and fathers and parents and people to adults to work.
I think we should have universal birth to, college education myself. I think it's crazy that we don't already do that. But, what they'll tell you is, no, they're coming here because of low taxes. That's why they're coming to North Carolina. So, it's a challenge. It's a debate, isn't it?
What do you hear about the legislature's plans with regard to voter suppression issues? Are they doing anything now, and what are their ultimate plans?
I think what's likely is we're going to see them probably working mostly around the edges, but we're already seeing efforts. Clearly, we're going to have the voter ID fight continues. At some point, it seems likely that the judicial remedies that opponents of voter ID have pursued are going to probably run up against a wall. And at some point, it seems pretty likely we're going to have voter ID in North Carolina. We're already seeing efforts to, during the 2022 election, we had a situation where, well, if your mailed-in ballot came in a few days after the election, maybe it could still be counted. That's likely perhaps to change. They'll be working around the edges to make it just a little bit tougher to vote. I'm not expecting a broad-based new attack on voting rights, but for instance, there's been this effort, at the national level to try and provide additional funding to local counties because so many counties don't have enough money to really properly pay the workers and staff the polling places. And some private funds were raised to help with that, and that's their vote as far as the Republicans running the General Assembly are concerned. They don't want to see that. I think it's pretty clear. The perception is that they generally have figured out that it probably works to their advantage to keep voting numbers down, especially in lower income areas, anywhere near a university. Again, look at what they've done in the courts. These folks they're very serious, they play hardball, they want to win, and they're trying to use whatever tactic they can. So we don't expect it to be like 2013 when we had the so-called monster voting law that was it was an omnibus anti-voting law, but I'm sure we'll continue to see them chipping around the edges for the rest of the session, probably in the budget. Anything else we can talk about? Yes, sir.
What's the difference between the current Republican Party and Dixiecrats?
What's the difference between the current Republican Party and the Dixiecrats? Well, it is interesting, isn't it, that the history. This is an interesting debate I sometimes get into with with some of my conservative friends, they will identify the Democratic Party as the party of white supremacy and racism, which of course it was 100 years ago. There's no doubt about that. But you can almost draw a direct line between the, sometimes even within families of the people who were leaders in that movement 60 years ago in North Carolina, and their migration to the Republican Party. Obviously, the Democratic Party in North Carolina now is hugely dependent upon people of color to provide votes for it. It is clearly the party that has become the party of people of color. It is a much broader, more diverse, unruly, disorganized tent that Democrats have. Republicans have become, in many ways, Strom Thurmond was the person who sort of symbolized that transition of the Republican Democrat to the Republican Party. That said, there are plenty of modern Republicans who reject the notion of white supremacy, at least overt white supremacy and racial discrimination, and believe that they are truly colorblind. I mean, the whole debate over white supremacy in our society is a fascinating one that every white person needs to think about and confront, probably, even progressives. But there are, there's no doubt that there's some interesting historical trends that we can see if we look back to the history of the Dixiecrats and the white racist Democrats in North Carolina throughout the South. Yes, sir.
Yeah, comment on the expulsion of the two Jordans in Tennessee, and how gerrymandering and so on is played a role in
So this is y'all, of course, been following this, the story of the expulsion of the African-American lawmakers in Tennessee in the aftermath of the sort of spontaneous protests that arose after the horrific shooting in Nashville and the refusal of the legislative leadership to do anything about gun violence in their state. I probably know as much as you do. I've had at one point I actually had communication with one of those lawmakers early in his career who had reached out because of some mutual friends. It seems as if perhaps they may actually end up getting back in the legislature pretty quickly, being reappointed because of the system that Tennessee uses to fill vacancies. I guess one hopes that's the case, but I thought the fact that it got so much national attention, I think a lot of people were shocked. It seemed like such a remarkably bold move by the leadership of the Tennessee General Assembly, but of course in many respects that perhaps reflects the times we live in now. We're seeing more of those kinds of the kinds of conflicts we might not have expected a couple of decades ago. So, and I forget there was a second part to the question.
Well, just any,
Gerrymandering?
yeah, just I've heard or read gerrymandering. These guys are so smart, say you see, how are these two guys?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that is the case, and probably even more so in Tennessee than it is here. And as I alluded to earlier, I do think that there is a corrosive effect over time on the people who wield power in that way. I still think that over time it's going to take its toll on their ability to govern. I think it's going to invite corruption and shortcuts and people getting lazy because they have so much power, and eventually I think that may catch up with them. But for a while they'll probably be able to get away with it, and wouldn't put past something like that happening here. I don't expect it to occur, but we've had remarkable incidents in our state house already with literally no debate being allowed on the budget. Surprise votes when members are off the floor. That kind of just absurd, throwing your weight around almost just because you can. Because they're going to win the vote anyway. Why can't we actually have a discussion, an open debate about some of the provisions in the budget? But no, you're just going to show you who's boss. You sometimes get that feeling that that's the way things are going. So, that's something Democrats have been guilty of in the past, probably not as much as the Republicans are now. They've sort of perfected it. You gotta give them credit for that. But it'll be interesting to see. Hope. I guess there's some hope. I saw where, interestingly enough, there was the lawmaker who allegedly urinated on another lawmaker's seat in Tennessee on the floor, and that lawmaker was actually Tom Tillis's brother. I had no idea. It was his seat. It was his seat that got urinated. So this guy was not kicked out of the legislature in Tennessee for urinating on Tom Tillis's brother's seat. At least that's the story one of my reporters was telling me today. I don't know, maybe it's great news. It's a remarkable time in American politics. But again, it's also important to remember sometimes you get so, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe how crazy it is. But it was pretty crazy 50 years ago. It was pretty crazy 100 years ago. There's a lot of crazy stuff that's going on in American politics and in North Carolina politics. And it's important maybe to keep a little perspective and not let yourself get too overwhelmed by it all. I think we'll probably get through it. One last question, maybe?
This morning I heard, and I don't know if it's substantiated, that Biden did announce that he plans to run again. And,
I think that's a common wisdom.
as a senior, who has millennial daughters, and like this lovely young woman here, I think the problem beyond gerrymandering is geriatrics. We've got too many old people trying to tell the young people how to run this country. And when they need to, what they need to do is retire and volunteer their wisdom and their time, because they obviously have plenty of time and plenty of money to get a lot of good things done. But they won't give up the control to the people whose future, like this young woman and my millennial daughters, who have investment in our, in their freedom and our future. And
This is
I vote, and
sure.
if again, if he is a candidate, because I will never place another vote on a Republican, even though I was a purple constituent until.
Remember,
My daughter said, I didn't know you were such a liberal. I said, I am not a liberal, I am a progressive, and I want to see this country progress and not regress, because I want you and your young friends and partners to have every chance that I have. And we screwed it up. And we are continuing to screw it up.
well, here, I will say this about Biden.
If you're gonna change the age of a judge, let's roll it back.
Well, this is not like a new debate. I hear what you're saying. I mean, I remember John Kennedy, giving his inaugural speech in 1961 saying that the torch has been passed to a new generation. I remember Barack Obama getting elected in 2008 as a young man still in his 40s. These are debates. I remember the Vietnam War when there was the fight to give 18-year-olds the right to vote. These are debates that our society, which has ebbed and flowed, positive and negative directions. I see both sides. I have to say, I personally think Joe Biden has been one of the most effective presidents we've ever had, at least in recent decades. And I'm struck by the fact that I used to be a lobbyist in Illinois. I had lots of friends who worked with Barack Obama. I actually left Illinois before Barack got elected, but I remember my friends calling me and telling me, wow, man, we got this state senator, we got to hear about this guy, Barack Obama. And, I'm a huge fan of President Obama. I think he was a brilliant, wonderful man. You know what? I think he'd have been a better president when he was 60 than when he was 48. I think he suffered for not having had as much experience in Washington, and I think he blinked early on in his term when it came to the recession and the steps that needed to be taken to get the economy really going. So it's a double-edged sword. I agree, Biden faces enormous challenges with young people. He faces enormous challenges getting reelected. On the other hand, I'm not sure who the substitute is, who the Democrats have to take his place. It's going to be fascinating. I clearly think that Biden would defeat Donald Trump if he's the nominee. I don't know about Ron DeSantis. I find it hard to believe that the man would be elected president, but anything's possible. Donald Trump is elected president. So, you raised some really good points. I'm with you. I'm getting up there too, and I have adult children who I want very much to be leaders in our country. So, I see both sides. I see what you're saying, but I'm not sure it's guaranteed to get better if Biden just steps aside and says somebody else take over. It's unprecedented times right now. Anyway, I've gone on way too long. Thank you all for listening.